Thanks, Alex, for that nice introduction. And it's interesting that Alex used that word to describe me because one of the things I often say to my classes is that historians like to use big words because it makes us feel more ambidextrous. So, without further ado, friends, we are gathered here tonight, not far from a place where a group of like-minded people gathered to build a community which they believe would do nothing less than bring salvation to the entire human family. Along with them, they brought a unique set of beliefs, esoteric rituals, and an overwhelming urge to conquer a new frontier and carve out a home for themselves. I refer, of course, to the Johnson Space Center, not far away from here in Houston, Texas. Now, while members of the John Whitmer Historical Association often find themselves focused on the controversies, calamities, and adventures of men and women in the 19th century frontier, today I want to focus my comments on the final frontier and explore the connections between the women and men linked to Joseph Smith's restoration and the exploration of space. I've chosen no single person to make the centerpiece of my remarks. Instead, I wish to examine the theological, historical, and sacramental links between the principles of Joseph's restoration and the ideals that motivate and inspire people of all backgrounds to conquer another frontier, spaceflight. Gathered near the home of one group of 19th century pioneers, specifically Lyman White and his community of saints, we now consider another group of pioneers which made their way to Texas, also intent on taming a new frontier. Which brings us to the topic of the night. I'm going to say this hopefully in the right way. Saints in space. Thank you. Now, I'm going to ask for a little audience participation because I know that we always do the presidential address on Saturday night after everybody's been out running around all day and everybody is tired. So I'm going to ask you to participate as I introduce each part. The next part is religion, say it with me, in space. Thank you, well done. While most people consider spaceflight to be a secular venture, it has been and likely always will be linked to religious concerns. This manifests itself in obvious ways. Many of us will recall when Apollo 8, the first manned mission to orbit the moon, read from the book of Genesis in a broadcast from their spacecraft on Christmas Eve, 1986. Astronauts Bill Anders, Jim Lovell, and Frank Borman all took turns reading of Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 through 8, while the surface of the moon passed gently beneath them. Back on Earth, 1 in 4 people, roughly 1 billion souls in 64 different countries, listened to the reading. Within 24 hours after the live broadcasts, recordings of the reading reached audiences in 30 additional countries. No less a figure than Walter Cronkite later reflected, saying, "You know, I'm afraid my first reaction was, this is a little too much. This is even a little dramatic. I might have even thought, this is a little corny." But by the time Borman finished reading that excerpt from the Bible, I had to admit that I had tears in my eyes. It was really impressive and just the right thing to do at the moment, just the right thing. The Genesis reading of Apollo 8 was also typical of religion in the space age in that it created a firestorm of controversy over the role of religion in spaceflight. Madeleine Murray O'Hair, the head of the American Atheists, filed a lawsuit against NASA seeking to ban astronauts and government employees from participating in religious practices while in space. Apollo 8 was not the first, nor would it be the last religious event to take place in space. Taking just the Apollo program as an example, it's clear that religious expectations came along with the quest to land a human on the moon from the beginning. A group called the Apollo Prayer League, the APL, set out to infuse the quest for the moon with religious purpose. Members of the APL consisted of scientists, NASA employees, NASA subcontractors, and just members of the general public with an interest in religion and spaceflight. It eventually grew to include 40,000 people in 57 different countries, and the APL soon set a goal of placing a Bible on the moon. Knowing the weight requirements, they opted to use a Bible captured on a piece of microfilm, with all 1,245 pages on a surface no larger than a postage stamp. When Madeleine O'Hair caught wind of the plan, she contacted the APL telling them, "I read with absolute disgust your plans to take your expletive so-called Bibles to the moon. If you persist in contaminating the space program with your foul, disgusting, expletive Christianity, we must take steps." The first attempt to place these Bibles came with the ill-fated flight of Apollo 13, which carried 512 microfilm Bibles in a fireproof packet. When Apollo 13 met with calamity and was barely able to make it home with its crew alive, Madeleine O'Hare memorably remarked, "You know why Apollo 13 exploded, don't you? Because it was carrying all those Bibles." 100 of the microfilm Bibles eventually made it to the moon on February 5th, 1971, when lunar module pilot Edgar Mitchell took them on his trip to the lunar surface and returned them safely to the Earth. The remaining Apollo flights were also filled with religious observances. During Apollo 15, James Irwin, another lunar module pilot, read part of the Book of Psalms. Also during Apollo 15, Commander Dave Scott left a small red leather Bible on the lunar rover's console just before he left the surface. And Gene Cernan, a committed Catholic and commander of Apollo 17, the final mission to date to the surface of the moon, climbed the lunar ladder, made the sign of the cross, and then placed his finger on the lunar ascent switch. The last words spoken by a human on the surface of the moon were Cernan's benedictory comments, "We leave as we came, and God willing, as we shall return with peace and hope for all mankind, Godspeed the crew of Apollo 17. It's not surprising that religious sentiments enter the conversation when travelers depart the bonds of earth for what early man called the heavens. The sheer immensity of seeing the beautiful blue marble from the moon has caused an almost religious sense of enlightenment in billions of people. Some observers wondered if poets and theologians should accompany missions into space. Astronaut Michael Collins said, "I've said that the best crew for an Apollo mission would be a philosopher, a priest, and a poet." But then he also added, "Unfortunately, they would kill themselves trying to fly the spacecraft." While I will only cite a few prominent examples of religion in human spaceflight, and there are many more I could have mentioned, it's clear that when human beings leave the surface of the earth, they take along their hopes, their dreams, and their religious sentiments with them. The religious movements associated with Joseph Smith's restoration have a theology and an accompanying scriptural canon that is uniquely attuned to the quest to sever the surly bonds of earth and reach out into the greater cosmos. The revelations of the restoration might take on these characteristics because they were written down after the scientific contributions of Copernicus, Galileo, and other stargazers. The restoration also took place post-Enlightenment and reflects a different understanding of the place of humankind in the universe. Believers and non-believers can both see this as an outcome stated in the revelations themselves, that the text came to the early followers of the movement after the manner of their language, that they might come to an understanding. The scriptures of the early restoration takes a broad view of the universe, placing earth as a part, not the center of it. In one of Joseph Smith's translations of the Bible, the prophet Moses is told, "Worlds without number have I created, and I created them for mine own purpose, but only an account of this earth and the inhabitants thereof give I unto you. For behold, there are many worlds which have passed away by the word of my power, and there are many also which now stand, and numberless are they unto man. But all things are numbered unto me, for they are mine, and I know them." However anyone feels about Joseph Smith or his work, this text seems prescient in our time, when scholars from Pennsylvania State University and Brigham Young University have constructed computer models using data from the Kepler Space Telescope, suggesting that there may be as many as a quintillion number of Earth-like planets in the observable universe of 50 billion galaxies so far. Joseph Smith's revelations are permeated with a cosmic tone. In the Book of Mormon, when Alma the Elder confronts an Antichrist teacher, his primary evidence for divinity is even the earth, and all things which are upon the face of it, yea, its motion, yea, and all the planets which move in their regular form do witness that there is a supreme creator. One of Joseph Smith's translation projects added a vignette of Abraham reasoning on the principles of astronomy in the courts of Pharaoh. And in the same text, the Book of Abraham also places God as a citizen of the physical universe, even naming the star set nigh unto the throne of God, and appointing different times and reckonings to the planets throughout the universe. While the wonder and awe of the cosmos, as shown to us through space exploration, inspires poets, philosophers, and theologians, what are the practical fruits of the revelations of the restoration in the space age? Just as a believing Catholic like Gene Cernan was informed by his religious views during his time on the moon, thousands of members of restoration movements have made an impact in the space industry, particularly in NASA. It would be prohibitive to name all of them, so I will cite a few prominent examples, which leads us to the next part: administrators in space. My timing was a little off there. We start with James Chipman Fletcher, who's one of the most eminent names in the history of NASA. To date, he is the only person to have served as the head of NASA on 2 different occasions, from 1971 to 77 and from 1986 to 1989. He was also an active member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. As an administrator, Fletcher earned the respect, or at least grudging admiration, of his critics and peers. The Wall Street Journal called him a competent but unexciting manager who had no flair for politics or publicity. Barry Goldwater praised Fletcher's superb grasp of management, finance, organization, and a thorough understanding of the science involved, adding, under Fletcher's management of NASA, it's become a smooth-working, intelligently financed organization knowing exactly where it's going. During Fletcher's first term as NASA administrator, a number of important developments took place. He oversaw the final Apollo missions and the beginnings of the Space Shuttle program. During Fletcher's tenure, the Viking missions orbited and landed on Mars, providing a first close-up look at the red planet. You can also see Fletcher here with the crew of another distinguished spaceship, the Starship Enterprise. As part of his responsibilities, Fletcher took on dozens of speaking assignments every year, becoming an important advocate for the goals of the space program. One of the central themes of Fletcher's leadership was the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. When speaking about the possibility of finding other intelligent life in the universe, some of Fletcher's religious tenets come through. In a hypothetical discussion of what might happen if contact was made with other intelligent life, Fletcher reflected, most people would be in a very difficult philosophical position. Few among us could conjure up the kind of religious position that easily reconciles the notion that God created other worlds just for us, unless there was something intended for us to do about them. Nevertheless, it's clear that if we're all alone, then we're all precious. And if we're really that unique, we must ask ourselves whether it is really stable to be sitting here on our own planet when we could be extending the future of the human race on new worlds beyond, which only Homo sapiens among all life forms can do. Given the budget deficits and other hard economic realities of our era, many of you might be scratching your heads by now and wondering whether Fletcher lives in a dream world. Is he serious when he talks of space colonies or pursuing the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, or is he a hopeless visionary? Rather than try to answer, let me remind you of some words in the book of Proverbs, and they are, when there's no vision, the people perish. Fletcher's vision of other worlds was part of his theme, pushing onto new frontiers. Among his ecclesiastical responsibilities, Fletcher served as a Sunday school teacher, and he once cited the Old Testament as a favorite course of study. On one occasion, he drew parallels between Abraham leaving Ur of the Chaldees to settle in Haran to the desire of mankind to push back frontiers. He optimistically was paraphrased as saying that God-given desire will likely result in the colonization of space and a manned voyage to Mars by the end of the century. Fletcher's second call to service came in 1986, following the catastrophic explosion of the Space Shuttle Challenger. He oversaw a safety overhaul of the entire shuttle fleet and remained at his post when the shuttle program returned to space with the launch of the Space Shuttle Discovery in 1988. At the time of Discovery's successful launch, he commented, "From the early days of near despair to Discovery's flawless landing at Edwards, we learned a lot in the interim. I believe our most profound lesson is that with courage, imagination, and will, Americans can overcome adversity and even meet the most difficult challenge successfully. Our limits will only be those that we ourselves erect." Fletcher passed away shortly after he left NASA the second time in 1989. But in an interview given just a few years before his death, he actually cited one of his proudest accomplishments not being anything government-related, but church-related. "I had a bunch of 16-year-olds," he wrote, "and most of them turned out pretty good." He noted in speaking of a preschool he served in during his work in the aerospace industry in California. "I must have taught it for 5 or 6 years. I went on outings with them and so forth. I've kept in touch with not all of them, but a few of them, and they keep in touch with each other. Some fell by the wayside, as you might expect, but most of them turned out pretty good, and some of them still come by when we're here in Washington." One NASA historian summarized the connection between Fletcher's Latter-day Saint roots and his service in NASA, noting, "Influenced by a wide range of ideas and conceptions from a variety of sources, Fletcher still embraced a set of ideals and images that can be traced in part to his Western and Mormon background. The frontier imagery of an earlier era, a belief in extraterrestrial intelligence and a commitment to searching for it, and an adherence to the stewardship principle in calling for environmental responsibility. The influence of Fletcher's faith and how it influenced his time at NASA today rests in the hands of scholars, which brings us to the next segment of our discussion. If you're ready, historians in, we got to do it again. Historians in space. Thank you, well done. Between 1990 and 2002, Roger D. Launius served as the chief historian of NASA. Many members of the JWHA will recall Launius as the author of Joseph Smith III, Pragmatic Prophet, 1988, or for his involvement in numerous works of history surrounding the Restoration. Roger, who self-identifies as RLDS, is best known in JWHA circles as a restoration historian, though he's more widely known in academia for his dozens of works on the space program. He's written and edited over 20 books on the history of manned spaceflight. And finding himself at a unique confluence of science, history, and theology, Launius was also influenced by his origins as a member of the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Launius's work in restoration history in the space program came together in one of his more provocative arguments in a 2013 article entitled Escaping Earth, Human Spaceflight as Religion. He began by listing 14 characteristics utilized by the Internal Revenue Service to legally identify a religion, and spaceflight matched on all 14. In this comparison, Launius notes, from the beginning, human space exploration has represented as much as anything else a spiritual quest, a purification of humanity, and a search for absolution and immortality. Spaceflight, a spiritual quest, found expression from the very first unveiling of the American space program. Launius also simplified the 14 points needed to legally identify a religion down to 6. In reading these and in my conversations with Roger, I was struck on the overlap between the religious faiths of the Restoration movement and the more hallowed aspects of the space program. Launius, who was speaking about religion in general and not the Restoration specifically, called them a convergence of several characteristics, specifically a distinctive worldview and the ideology of salvation, revered leaders and condemned villains, sacred texts, commonality of rituals, rules, and shared experiences, and attention to the divine, holy, mysterious, sacred, and sublime. And let's consider each of these as they converge, these characteristics separately. First, a distinctive worldview and ideology of salvation. The galvanizing principle in both Restoration theology and the space program is the concept of salvation. True, the two philosophies differ and offer different forms of salvation. Restoration theology offers salvation in the form of expiation for sins and a universal resurrection for all mankind. The space program offers salvation in the sense that the fragility of the earth makes the survival of the human species tentative. The motivation for many space travelers is a desire to not put all of our eggs in one basket. A species on 2 planets has a better chance at salvation than a single planet. But both share a unique perspective that comes from the kind of panoptic vision of the earth and its purpose. After Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon beheld a vision of the different degrees of glory on 16 February 1832, Joseph Smith spoke of it fondly, saying, "The sublimity of the idea, the purity of the language, the rewards for faithfulness and the punishments for sin are so much beyond the narrow-mindedness of men that every honest man is constrained to exclaim, 'It came from God.'" It's striking to note the language used here when it's contrasted with what one writer has popularized as the overview effect, or the impact on a person that comes from seeing the earth from orbit or from the moon. Salvational language is often found in the statements of those who have experienced the overview effect. Gene Cernan, an astronaut on Gemini 9, Apollo 10, and Apollo 17, stated, "You look back home and you say to yourself, that's humanity, love, feeling, and thought. You don't see the barriers of color and religion and politics that divide this world. You wonder if you could get everyone in the world up there, wouldn't they have a different feeling, a new perspective?" United States Senator and Latter-day Saint Jake Garn expressed similar feelings about the power of the overview effect. He wrote a letter to Latter-day Saint leader M. Russell Ballard that was quoted in a general conference of the church. Garn wrote, "It is impossible for me to describe the beauty of the earth. It is a breathtaking, awe-inspiring spiritual experience to view the earth from space while traveling at 25 times the speed of sound. I could also look into the blackness of the vacuum of space and see billions of stars and galaxies millions of light years away. The universe is so vast as to be impossible to comprehend, but I did comprehend the hand of God in all things. I felt his presence throughout my 7 days in space. I know that God created this earth and the universe. I know that we are his children wherever we live on the earth, without regard to nationality or the color of our skin. Most important, I know that God lives and is the creator of us all. This overview effect is common in ancient scripture when prophets were taken by God to high mountains. Do we esteem those granted a higher perspective than any mountain can offer the same kind of majesty? And do we also offer the healthy perspective that a person granted such a broad view is also still a flawed individual with their own biases and foibles? Another Latter-day Saint astronaut, Don Lind, mentioned that he discussed the theological possibilities with just about everyone who went to the moon and concluded, obviously, the people who had a profound religious background before they left were impressed in those terms. And those who were too busy to be religious before they left were too busy to be religious when they came back. So I don't think that sort of thing changed anybody. The next pattern is revered leaders and condemned villains. Because of their prominence, there's also been a tendency to reduce the complex men and women of the early Restoration to the men and women of spaceflight into simplified stereotypes of heroes and villains. It's striking how dependent on one's background or upbringing names like Joseph Smith, Brigham Young, Joseph Smith III, James Strang, or Emma Smith can easily fall into these categories. There's a tendency on our part to reduce these individuals to an uncomplicated set of characteristics that support our worldview. We want a world populated with heroes and villains because in a lot of ways that's comforting. Since early spaceflight was seen as a salvational affair, we tended to do the same thing with the men and women who flew aloft in the heavens. Americans saw men like Alan Shepard and John Glenn as valiant gladiators fighting for our way of life. Figures on the other side of the equation, such as Yuri Gagarin or Alexei Leonov, were admired for their courage, but despised because they served a different country and ideology. Seeing any conflict as salvational causes us to draw lines quickly. We want the good guys to cheer for and the bad guys to root against. Both sides also produce their fair share of martyrs as well, as figures like Yuri Gagarin, Gus Grissom, and Christa McAuliffe, who gave their lives to the cause. And this isn't Christa McAuliffe, that's Sally Ride. At its best, both religion and spaceflight gave us perspectives that transcend the us versus them approach that we easily fall into. Some of the most beautiful phrases of the Restoration echo this value. He inviteth them all to come unto him and partake of his goodness, and he denieth none that come unto him, black and white, bond and free, male and female, and he remembereth the heathen, and all are alike unto God, both Jew and Gentile. After the Apollo 11 landings, astronaut Michael Collins recalled, "People came up to us and said, 'We did it,' not 'you Americans did it.' They felt that we humans had done it. It was a short-lived attitude, but something like a lunar landing can have that kind of effect." The next characteristic was sacred texts. The Restoration introduced a number of new texts joining the biblical canon as sacred scripture to millions of people. These texts provide hope and inspiration. Many of them we learn as children and then find that they resonate in our souls when we face the complexities of adulthood. Most members of Restoration movements can recite lines from the Book of Mormon or the Doctrine and Covenants, such as, "Adam fell that men might be, and men are that they might have joy." Many of us construct our human interactions around phrases such as, "The worth of souls is great in the sight of God." Human spaceflight has also produced sacred and inspirational texts influential the world over. Most of us can not only produce the words, but the cadence of Neil Armstrong's first words when he set foot on the moon. Can everybody do this with me? "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." Everybody can do that, and they say it the exact way that Neil Armstrong said it. Many people as well can quote the words of John F. Kennedy as he successfully evangelized the quest to land a person on the moon. This is an excerpt from one of his most well-known speeches that he gave about human spaceflight, which I'll play right now.
We meet in an hour of change and challenge, in a decade of hope and fear, in an age of both knowledge and ignorance. The greater our knowledge increases, the greater our ignorance unfolds. No man can fully grasp how far and how fast we have come. But condense, if you will, the 50,000 years of man's recorded history in a time span of but a half a century. Stated in these terms, we know very little about the first 40 years, except at the end of them, advanced man had learned to use the skins of animals to cover them. Then about 10 years ago, under this standard, man emerged from his caves to construct other kinds of shelter. Only 5 years ago, man learned to write and use a cart with wheels. Christianity began less than 2 years ago. The printing press came this year. And then less than 2 months ago, during this whole 50-year span of human history, the steam engine provided a new source of power. Newton explored the meaning of gravity. Last month, electric lights and telephones and automobiles and airplanes became available. Only last week did we develop penicillin and television and nuclear power. This is a breathtaking pace, and such a pace cannot help but create new ills as it dispels old. So it is not surprising that some would have us stay where we are a little longer, to rest, to wait. If this capsule history of our progress teaches us anything, it is that man in his quest for knowledge and progress is determined and cannot be deterred. We shall send to the moon, 240,000 miles away, a giant rocket more than 300 feet tall on an untried mission to an unknown celestial body, and then return it safely to Earth. But why, some say, the moon? Why choose this as our goal? And they may well ask, why climb the highest mountain? Why, 35 years ago, fly the Atlantic? We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone. And therefore, as we set sail, we ask God's blessing on the most hazardous and dangerous and greatest adventure on which man has ever embarked.
That's a successful evangelist if I've ever heard one. These texts also served as a source of comfort in times of need. When my grandfather passed away while I was a missionary, I remember sending a letter to my family where I copied a text out of the Book of Mormon. Behold, it has been made known unto me by an angel that the spirits of all men, as soon as they're departed from this mortal body, yea, the spirits of all men, whether they be good or evil, are taken home to that God who gave them life. One of my other vivid memories was watching the coverage of the Challenger disaster and hearing Ronald Reagan recite the words of a poem to comfort the grieving nation over the loss of the shuttle crew. He said, "The crew of the Space Shuttle Challenger honored us by the manner in which they lived their lives. We will never forget them, nor the last time we saw them this morning as they prepared for their journey and waved goodbye and slipped the surly bonds of earth to touch the face of God." Finally, and I'll combine the last two, the divine, holy, mysterious, sacred, and sublime, and ritual, rules, and shared experiences. The idea of holy, sacred, or sublime experiences is often intertwined with the rituals, rules, and shared experiences of religion. An early text of the Restoration reads, "In the ordinances thereof, the power of godliness is manifest." Of course, believers can find God anywhere, but for those who are part of organized religion, the rituals and ceremonies are often the place where we see, hear, and feel most strongly the powers of godliness. That brings us to the final part of my address, if everyone's ready. Sacraments in space. Well done. From the beginning of human spaceflight, a sense of holiness and divinity rested with many of the participants. For instance, one of the first acts that took place on the moon after Neil Armstrong declared the immortal words, "The eagle has landed," was a quiet ritual. Buzz Aldrin, a Presbyterian, paused shortly after the landing and asked Neil Armstrong if he could take a moment to take the Eucharist. With all the controversy surrounding the reading from Genesis on Apollo 9 a few months earlier, the ceremony was kept quiet and was not known until many years after the moon landings. It was depicted in the miniseries From the Earth to the Moon. I'm going to show a clip from that. Neil Armstrong is played by Tony Goldwyn, and Buzz Aldrin is played by Bryan Cranston.
Neil, there's something I would like to do if you don't mind. I cleared it with Deke. After all the grief that Frank and the others got for reading from Genesis, I can't be specific, but something I want to do. Houston, Tranquility, over.
Tranquility, Houston, go ahead.
Roger, this is the LEM pilot. I'd like to take this opportunity to ask every person listening in, whoever or wherever they may be, to pause a moment and contemplate the events of the past few hours. And to give thanks in his or her own way. Over.
Roger, Tranquility Base.
I am the vine and you are the branches. Whoever remains in me and I in him will bear much fruit. For you can do nothing without me.
The taking of the Eucharist on the moon illustrates another important question where religion and human spaceflight converge. With a permanent human presence in space and on other planets being presented as a salvational proposition, how does religious practice adapt to non-terrestrial settings? For instance, how does a Muslim astronaut pray while facing toward Mecca when they're orbiting the Earth at speeds exceeding thousands of miles per hour? How does a Jewish astronaut observe Sabbath from sundown to sundown when they're on a space station where the sun rises and sets every 90 minutes or approximately 16 times a day? For restoration movements, the same questions about religious practice and spaceflight linger. One case study is Don Lind, who served as a member of the astronaut corps from 1966 to 1986. Lind was a devout member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Lind also holds the dubious distinction of waiting longer than any other American to fly in space. Lind later noted, "I set a record. No one has waited for spaceflight longer than I have. I hope nobody ever has to do that. But with 6.5 years spent in training and for the 2 flights that didn't fly, and then delays getting the shuttle program going, and with the Apollo fire, there were long delays, and so yes, it was 19 years before I got to fly." Lind was originally scheduled to go to the moon on Apollo 20, but the last 3 missions of the program never occurred because of budget cuts. He worked on the Skylab program, but with the number of flights dwindling, he never had a chance to serve in space. Finally, he was assigned to serve as a mission specialist on the 29th of April to 6th of May, 1985, aboard the Space Shuttle Challenger. During the flight, Lind was part of a 7-man crew who conducted investigations in crystal growth, drop dynamics, atmosphere trace gas spectrophy, solar and planetary atmospheric simulation, cosmic rays, laboratory animals, and human medical monitoring. During the 7 days he spent in space, Lind also conducted an ecclesiastical experiment. Lind worked with church leaders and NASA officials to receive special permission to wear his temple garments while he served aboard the shuttle. He also received permission from his bishop to hold a brief sacramental service while he was in orbit on Sunday, May 5th. Lind copied the prayers for the sacrament into his flight data volume. He later wrote about solving some of the technical problems of performing the ordinance in spaceflight. He wrote, "The second technical problem concerning the sacrament was how to follow the scriptural direction. After this manner, he shall kneel. In weightlessness, kneeling is not easily accomplished. However, I managed to solve that problem. For privacy, I'd planned to hold my sacrament meeting in a sleep station, a compartment much like a Spartan Pullman berth. By kneeling on what I thought would be the ceiling and resting my shoulders against my sleeping bag, I could maintain the standard reverent kneeling position if I didn't worry about up or down. In this way, this orientation had a special meaning for me. I know that looking up towards heaven is not only symbolic of looking toward our Father in heaven, but since I didn't know where Kolob is located on the celestial sphere. However, I was strangely taken by the thought that never before had I been able to kneel to show reverence and at the same time face heavenward towards my eternal Father." With the ordinance completed, Lind was euphoric. The whole experience was extremely moving and very spiritual, filled with that special closeness to the Lord that I normally only feel in temples. I suspect that this will always be the most memorable sacrament service of my life, he later reflected. A few months after his mission aboard the Challenger, Lind spoke in a general conference of the church. On the broadcast, he was not credited by any ecclesiastical position. The screen simply read, "Don Lind, astronaut." The experience in orbit was transformative for Lind. He spoke about how the experience changed his perspective as both a scientist and a Latter-day Saint. This is an excerpt from his general conference talk.
The first time I had a minute to stop and just look at the earth, the absolute beauty of the scene brought tears to my eyes. Now, in weightlessness, tears don't roll quietly down your cheeks. They sit in front of your eyeballs and get bigger and bigger, and in a minute, you feel like a guppy looking up through the aquarium. Now, try to imagine what it was like for me to have that scene in front of me and then have the fragments of a half a dozen scriptures pop into my mind. From the Psalms, the heavens declare the glory of God. If you've seen the heavens from the 88th section of the Doctrine and Covenants, you have seen God moving in his majesty and power. I'm sure you can imagine the closeness I felt to my Father in heaven as I looked down at one of his beautiful creations. I was really stirred by an increased awareness of what he did for us as the creator of our earth. That was one of the most moving experiences of my life.
Don Lind was not the last space traveler to participate in a religious ordinance in space. In 1994, 3 Catholic astronauts took Holy Communion while on board the Space Shuttle Endeavour. Israeli astronaut Ilan Ramon, who later died in the Columbia disaster, recited a Jewish Shabbat Kaddish prayer while in orbit. As recently as 2017, Russian cosmonaut Sergei Rezhenkov took a relic of Saint Seraphim of Sawarsky, a Russian Orthodox saint, to space. It seems that religion, as part of humanity, will also always be a part of human spaceflight. But even the most devout among space travelers have noticed that attempts to turn spaceflight into a wholly religious experience have their limits. Buzz Aldrin later questioned his decision to take the Eucharist on the moon, writing, "We had come in space in the name of all mankind, be they Christians, Jews, Muslims, animists, agnostics, or atheists. But at the time, I could think of no greater way to acknowledge the Apollo 11 experience than by giving thanks to God." Don Lind noted, "In the Apollo era, some people wanted to believe that going into space would reinforce religious beliefs, and therefore they almost read that into anything the astronauts said. That offended me, because I don't think you get converted to religion by going on a trip to the moon or to Cincinnati or to any place else. I think religion is a more profound experience than that." At the same time, spaceflight, particularly in its early years, captured some things that sometimes are lacking in our history and our theology, a sense of awe and wonder at the beauty of the universe. Noted cosmologist Carl Sagan once mused, "In some respects, science has surpassed religion in delivering awe. How is it that hardly any major religion has looked at science and concluded, this is better than we thought? The universe is much bigger than our prophets said, grander, more subtle, more elegant. God must be even greater than we dreamed." Instead, they say, no, my God is a little God, and I want him to stay that way. He then added, "A religion, old or new, that stressed the magnificence of the universe as revealed by modern science might be able to draw forth reserves of reverence and awe hardly tapped by the conventional faiths. Sooner or later, such a religion will emerge. As historians, we look to the past. We deconstruct, demystify, and sometimes disillusion ourselves and others in our search for the truth. But we must remember that part of the historical enterprise is also to astound, to delight, and to inspire. We have a rich history, a beautiful theology, and a promise of newer and better worlds to explore. These worlds are not just defined in physical space, but in intellectual spaces and spiritual realms that we continue to explore. My exploration over these last few months of the confluence and the history of spaceflight and the possibilities of religious history in new places show that there are untold wonders and new frontiers for us to all explore. And that it's just important, as we look to the past, for us to, at times, look to the future. Thank you.